Somewhere in America right now, a 52-year-old is checking their 401k balance, doing the math on when they can retire, and getting an answer they don't like. They did everything they were told. They avoided debt they couldn't afford. They kept a healthy cash cushion. They didn't gamble on speculative stocks. And yet the number on the screen is nowhere close to where it needs to be. Some people will tell you this is a savings problem, that this generation just didn't put enough money away. But look closer, and a stranger story shows up. A lot of these people saved plenty. The problem isn't how much they put in. It's what they did with it once it was there. So here's the real question. Why would a group of financially cautious, hardworking adults end up behind, not despite their caution, but because of it? 3 things are going on underneath this, and none of them are obvious from the outside. First, why did an entire cohort of investors quietly pull back from the one asset class that actually builds wealth over decades, right when they had the most time left to use it? Second, who actually benefits when a 40-something keeps 6 figures sitting in a savings account earning next to nothing? And third, the one nobody wants to say out loud, what if the financial lesson an entire generation learned in their 20s was the wrong lesson for the life they'd actually go on to live? There's an old flying instructor saying about a specific kind of pilot error. A pilot enters a cloud bank, loses the horizon, and instead of trusting the instruments, trusts their gut, and their gut, shaped by what the plane was doing 30 seconds ago, flies them straight into the ground. Investors do a version of this too. They set a course based on the last thing that scared them, and they keep flying that course long after the storm has cleared. Keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to it more than once. Here's the assumption worth questioning before we go further, that being careful with money is always the safe choice. It sounds obviously true. Careful people don't get hurt, reckless people do. That's the whole moral of every personal finance article you've ever skimmed. But careful is not a fixed quality. It's a decision made under specific conditions, at a specific age, in a specific economy, and conditions change while the decision doesn't. A choice that protected you at 28 can quietly bleed you at 48, and the frightening part is that it feels like the exact same virtue the whole time. You don't notice the shift, because nothing about being cautious ever feels like a mistake in the moment. To understand why this generation drives with one foot on the brake, you have to go back to the specific moment a lot of them learned how money works. Picture someone born in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Their first real exposure to the stock market wasn't a slow, boring climb, it was watching retirement accounts get cut nearly in half within about 18 months. Between late 2007 and early 2009, the S&P 500 lost roughly 57% of its value, and the recovery back to the old highs took years, not months. If you were in your 20s or early 30s watching your parents' 401k statements arrive in the mail during that stretch, the lesson wasn't markets go up over time. The lesson was the market can vaporize a decade of savings without warning. And when a lesson like that lands early, it doesn't fade, it becomes the default setting. Researchers at Vanguard actually measured this. Looking across millions of retail investor accounts, they found that young adults who opened their first investment account after the 2008 crash were more than twice as likely to hold zero stock at all compared to people who'd started investing before the crash. Think about what that means. An entire cohort entered adulthood, opened their first retirement account, and chose to sit almost entirely in cash, during the exact decades when time in the market matters most. That's not a wild anecdote. That's a documented behavioral shift, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't show up as a headline. It shows up 20 years later, quietly, as a smaller number on a screen. Now here's the turn most people miss. This overcaution didn't stay contained to 20-somethings buying their first index fund. It followed them. The habits people build under stress in their 20s become the operating system they run on for decades, updated less often than you'd think, because nobody sends you a reminder that the economy of your 30s isn't the economy of your 20s. Let's put real numbers on where that's landed people now in their 40s, 50s, and early 60s, the group demographers call Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. According to Fidelity Investments account data, the average Gen X 401k balance sits somewhere around $215,000 to $220,000. That sounds almost respectable, until you look at the median instead of the average, the number that reflects the typical person rather than being dragged upward by a small group of big savers. The median Gen X 401k balance is closer to $65,000. That gap between the average and the median is the widest of any generation, and it tells you something important. A small slice of Gen X is doing extremely well, while most of the generation is nowhere close. And the Federal Reserve's own survey of consumer finances backs this up from a different angle. It found the typical Gen X household has somewhere between $40,000 and $115,000 saved for retirement in total, not just in a 401k, across everything. Financial planners generally point to something in the range of $500,000 to $1 million as the target for a comfortable retirement, depending on lifestyle and location. A separate 2025 survey from Schroders found Gen X carries the single largest expected retirement shortfall of any generation surveyed, around $400,000 between what they expect to have and what they believe they'll actually need. Boomers had pensions to fall back on. Gen X was the first generation to be handed a 401k instead, told to figure it out themselves, and then hit with the dot-com crash in their 20s, the 2008 crisis in their 30s and 40s, and a pandemic disruption in their 50s. 3 separate shocks, landing at 3 separate stages of a single career. So naturally, the instinct is to blame the shocks. But that's only half the story, and it's the comfortable half. The uncomfortable half is what happened after each shock, because the data shows Gen X didn't just get hit by market crashes. Many of them responded to being hit by pulling further back from the market, right when their working years, and their ability to recover, were running out. A generation that watched paper wealth disappear twice in 20 years developed a rational-sounding aversion to risk. The problem is that safe and cash-heavy aren't the same thing over a 30-year time horizon. Inflation doesn't take a break because you're feeling cautious. Money sitting in a savings account earning 2 or 3%, while prices climb around it, isn't neutral, it's quietly losing purchasing power every single year. It just doesn't feel like a loss, because the number on the statement never goes down. It just buys less. Here's where it gets even more layered, because Gen X isn't only undersaved, they're squeezed from both directions at once, in a way that shapes not just how much they have, but how much they're able to add going forward. This is the so-called sandwich generation problem, people in their late 40s and 50s who are simultaneously helping support aging parents and still dependent kids, sometimes paying for both a parent's care and a child's college tuition in the same month. Every dollar that goes toward a parent's medical bill or a kid's tuition is a dollar that isn't compounding in a retirement account. It's not a mistake, exactly, it's often an act of love and obligation. But it's also invisible math working against a generation that's already behind, tightening a bracket around what they can save just as they're supposed to be catching up. There's a third layer, and it's the one that trips up even people who consider themselves financially responsible, the assumption that a paid-off house counts as a retirement plan. Homeownership is genuinely a bright spot for this age group. Roughly 73% of Gen X households own their home, often with meaningful equity built up over 20 or 30 years. But equity in the house you're living in isn't liquid. You can't spend the value of your living room. Unless someone plans to sell, downsize, or take out a reverse mortgage, each of which comes with real costs and trade-offs, that equity sits on paper doing nothing for daily expenses in retirement. Plenty of people quietly comfort themselves with, well, at least I have the house, the same way you might comfort yourself that you have gas in the tank of a car you're not allowed to drive. Meanwhile, watch what's happening one generation behind. Older millennials, people born in the early to mid-1980s, are now crossing 40 themselves, some of them turning 44 or 45 this year. And the eerie part is they're carrying almost the exact same wound as Gen X, just acquired slightly differently. Millennials didn't watch 2008 happen to their parents from a safe distance, many of them graduated into it directly, entering the worst job market in decades with fresh degrees and, often, fresh student debt. Surveys have found millennials keeping close to half their net worth in cash, well above the roughly one-third the wider population holds, with meaningfully lower exposure to stocks despite having decades longer until retirement. One Reddit thread that made the rounds a while back put it about as plainly as it gets, someone in their 30s describing genuine anxiety at the thought of investing, tracing it straight back to watching a bank they worked for collapse during the financial crisis. That's not a spreadsheet problem. That's a nervous system problem that happens to show up in a spreadsheet. This is where the rearview mirror instinct really shows its cost, because millennials are about to make the same trade Gen X made, except with even more time on the table to lose. If a 28-year-old holds 30 years of decades-long market history in a savings account instead of the market, the difference between 2% and a long-run average closer to 9 or 10% compounded isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between retiring on your own terms and working an extra decade. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you: the fear driving that decision was completely rational in 2009. It is significantly less rational applied unchanged to your finances in 2026. The danger already passed. The reflex didn't. So let's return to where we started, because this is where all three threads tie together. Why did an entire cohort quietly retreat from the one asset class built to compound over decades, right when they had the most runway to use it. Because a trauma response doesn't come with an expiration date stamped on it, it has to be consciously updated, and most people never get the prompt to update it. Who benefits from a 40-something keeping 6 figures parked in near-zero yield cash? Nobody, really, not even the bank, not meaningfully. It's not a conspiracy. It's just a quiet, compounding cost that nobody profits from and everybody eventually pays, in the form of a smaller number decades later. And the uncomfortable lesson underneath it all, the caution these two generations learned wasn't wrong when they learned it. It's wrong now, unexamined, still steering a plane that came out of the clouds years ago. None of this means the fear was irrational to begin with, and none of it means the answer is reckless risk-taking as some kind of overcorrection. It means the instruments matter more than the gut feeling, especially once you can't see the horizon clearly anymore. Catch-up contributions exist for exactly this reason. Anyone 50 or older can currently put meaningfully more into a 401k each year than someone younger, specifically because the system assumes some people start playing catch-up later than planned. Fidelity's own numbers show that Gen X, as a group, actually now saves a higher share of income than millennials or Gen Z do, north of 15% between personal contributions and employer matches. The willpower to save is there. It's the allocation, where that money actually goes once it's saved, that's still flying on a decade-old setting. If there's one thing worth sitting with after all this, it's that the money habit that protects you is the one you actually go back and recheck, not the one you set once and trust forever because it felt right the last time things went wrong. Being careful was never the mistake. Forgetting to ask whether you're still flying through the same storm, that's the mistake. And if this is the kind of thing that makes you want to go check your own numbers a little more closely, that's really the whole point of a channel like this one.